Okay, so hi everybody, great to be here. Nice to have actually a succinct introduction that wasn't read off the Public Policy Forum website, so that's good. And I appreciate being, in the company of you folks. The unions have been important contributors to the Shattered Mirror to start with, and some of the conversations that have been proceeding since then. And indeed, there's almost impossible to get any kind of job data in this country of how many journalists are working in news organizations, particularly, and all we could get hold of was from CWA and Unifor. So thank you for that. We did 6 roundtables across the country, and in our roundtable for the prairies, Kim Trinacity represented you, and her views are really the entire report represents Kim's views. So if there's things that you don't like, I would just, don't take it up with me, take it up with her, okay? So, I think you guys know why it's called the Shattered Mirror. It's sort of named a little bit in tribute to Keith Davies' 1970 report, The Uncertain Mirror. And our feeling was, sadly, that the uncertain mirror was no longer uncertain. It was lots of shards that had broken off that mirror. News, democracy, and trust in the digital age, and those are the key precepts. So, look, there's I don't expect you, particularly you folks back there, to try to read the slides, and it's really not important to read the slides. I'll say most everything that's in the slides are good visual cues. There's 2 or 3 of them that have a lot of data points in them, so they'd be very difficult to read in any case. We have a coincidence of 3 things going on at the same time. The failure of the business model that has underwritten serious news over the years, the concentration of revenue, audience, and data in global platforms that have no civic ethos, no sense of even sort of thinking as publishers. I think they should probably be publishers, and they should be treated as publishers and held responsible as publishers, but that's not the culture that they have, certainly. And then the assault on truth and trust that we've been seeing increasingly, and is manifesting itself again in the French election that's going on right now. So I just do a real quick, very quick review of what somebody, when I showed them, said it sort of reads like a tragic novel in some ways. And so, this is the pattern of paid circulation of newspapers in Canada from 1950 projected out to 2015, but sort of just projected out where it's going. In 1950, before I was born, and I suspect most anybody in the room was born, there were 101.2 newspapers delivered for every 100 households in the country. That was the great days. But it's interesting. It's been on a slide ever since then. It's been on a slide with the advent of television. It's been on a slide with the coming of supper-hour newscasts throughout the world, and that killed afternoon papers. Really, so it's a long, long slide down. The one thing that newspapers had that only they had was classified ad revenue. It was a very particular good fit in the world. And classified ad revenue actually held for a lot of years after Craigslist, et cetera, which is interesting. It held for about 10 years, over $800 million. And then and I don't think there's necessarily any causality in it, but when Kijiji came to Canada, you see this massive slide. I suspect when we see numbers for 2016, those numbers will be about 100 million or under 100 million from a peak of 800 million not that long ago. That's, just a massive, massive vanishing of revenue. This is total ads, if you will, and again, you can see that decline is pretty steep for daily newspapers in blue. In green are the community newspapers, and they hold up a lot longer, but they've been falling pretty steadily since about 2011. So they are no longer salvation. On your right-hand side, is just the juxtaposition of the CBC and the daily newspaper revenue, ad and circulation together. So it would be a sharper thing if it was just ad revenue. And total CBC revenues, market revenues, and government revenues, the CBC. So you can see that the CBC felt a lot of pain with its cuts, but it's nothing compared to what daily newspapers have seen. So you can just imagine the amount of pain that has hit them. So what's the consequence of this decline? The consequence, and this is based on extrapolating really from the union data that we had, is that probably 1/3 of journalism jobs have disappeared since 2010, 2011. And we are left with a democratic deficit of too few reporters on the ground. And I think that's really what the report's mostly about. The report's about the loss of original journalism, boots on the ground, finding things out, covering your beats, going to city council, whatever that may look like in different ways in different communities across the country. The two scariest numbers that I think I saw as I was doing my research are on this slide. And I'll start with the one on, again, your right. So on your right, you have the growth over the last 10 years of digital ad revenue in Canada. At the time of the report, it was 4.6 billion from under a billion in 10 years. Last year, it was actually 5.5 billion. Those numbers out. So you have, more than about 6 times the revenue in 10 years, about a 600% growth in revenue. Newspapers, I can tell you because I was managing one at the time, thought that we would do okay in the digital ad game and transfer revenue over. Even aside from the question of dollars for dimes, for digital dimes, essentially the revenue has stayed of daily newspapers has stayed steady at between $230 and $240 million for 10 years. So as the market grew 6-fold, there was no growth at all for daily newspapers. Community newspapers got into digital much later, but they only have collectively about 40 million, so it's not a material amount of money to the problems at hand. So the public opinion story is very interesting, very nuanced, very subtle. We did a survey of 1,500 Canadians, a quantitative survey, and we did 6 focus groups across the country, 2 in French in Quebec, 4 in English, and elsewhere. And what they showed was this. People have, perhaps surprisingly and pleasantly surprisingly, a great respect for the role of journalism, for what journalists do in society. They understand very, very strongly the connection between journalism and democracy and holding democracy to account. They get a lot of their news off Facebook. They say they get a lot of the news off Facebook. They don't really know where that news originates. Our quantitative will show that probably about 70% of news actually originates on traditional news organizations' websites. But they say they get a lot of news off Facebook. And then in the focus groups, when they say that, they quickly then say, of course, unless it's important. and the moderator, I wasn't the moderator. I'm behind a glass, but the moderator goes, well, what do you do when it's important to you? And they say, well, when it's important to me, I don't really trust Facebook. I don't really trust my friends and my family to be telling me what's important. And I know that they don't have any reporters that go out, so I really want to go. And then they don't use the expression trusted brands, but they just as much say trusted brands. They start naming their local newspaper, their local TV or radio station. They name individual journalists. They name anchors. These are the people that they trust when something is important to them. So, we called it sort of like the 5% exception. Essentially, they want kind of a safety net of a news system there when they need that news system. They don't want to use that news system every day, but they know that they want it to be there when important things are going on. Now, there's a large gap between the trust levels that they feel for the news that they get on television, radio, magazines, and newspaper websites, and that they get on social media. And the gap in terms of complete trust and most trust is from, the high 60s percentage to, for social media, 13%. So, those are major, major significant differences in trust. People are, collectively actually very smart. What are they afraid will happen as news organizations continue to decline? I guess they're afraid of all these things, but they're afraid there'll be less investigative reporting. They're afraid that interestingly, that average citizens will be less well-informed and able to protect their rights. They will not have the information with which to protect their rights. Coverage of local news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're worried the objectivity of Canadian journalists will go down. So now you come kind of to the paradoxical payoff of them having the level of respect that they have for journalists and journalism and their role in democracy. They can't imagine the government paying for this in somehow or another subsidizing it, because it would defeat, to their mind, the very purpose for which they hold journalism in high regard, and that is holding public officials to account, and they believe that this would corrupt them. So you can say to them in the focus groups, well, what about the CBC? I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, what about the CBC? Not. And they just shrug and fall silent a little bit, and it doesn't completely persuade them. Now, they are, the more they know about news, the more they follow news, the more apt they are to be accepting of some kind of policy intervention if it comes to a question of, will there be news or will there not be news? But really, if you ask them, and we sent the moderator back a couple times in a couple of focus groups as we were sort of starting to see this pattern emerging, to say, okay, it's a hard choice. You're either not going to have news or you're going to need public support for news. Which will you go? And they basically, say that, could I have the candy over there? And they want to go home, because that's a hard question for them. But there's a plurality that would be accepting of that. So I don't think any of us want, well, maybe some of you want, I won't speak on your behalf. I come out of a newspaper background, and I remember when we were purchased at the Globe Mail by what became Bell Globe Media, by the telephone company, and I got to, I was, a reporter. I was auto bureau chief at the time, and several of us were brought to meet John Monty, the CEO of Bell Canada Enterprises, and one of the several of us was Eric Reguli, and Eric is very feisty, to say the least. And he said, what we got to do is we got to cut the value, we got to cut the price of the newspaper. We're in the newspaper war with the National Post at the time. We got to cut the price of the paper to 1 cent and just drive them out of business. And Monty said, well, how do you think that will play in Ottawa? And it took me a minute or two to kind of figure, trying to think, how will it play in Ottawa? Does it mean what will the Auto Bureau think about it? Or what he meant is that we're a regulated company and we're very sensitive to what the politicians and the regulators think of things. And it was just sort of like a cultural shock to me. I'd rather not be in that world. Having said that, and I think careful design can insulate you to a large extent for it. But who's going to finance news? Advertisers are cutting out, and there's structural issues. Even if you move the amount of advertising online of news companies that that they get in print, in volume terms, it's not worth as much. The unit value. There's structural economic reasons why digital ads aren't worth as much as print or television ads. It has to do with scarcity and lack of scarcity, essentially. The audience is basically not paying, but 9% of Canadians say that they subscribe to some form of website. branch plant news providers have shown themselves to be kind of fickle. So BuzzFeed sets up, BuzzFeed unsets up. You know, some are doing better than others. You know, Vice is terrific, Martin. You know, but I don't think it's a way for a country to fix its news problem probably. Benevolent billionaires has been spoken about. You know, I'm not against benevolent billionaires because in Canada we have two benevolent families in a sense who don't make money out of the newspaper business, the Demarest and the Thompsons, and they, you know, back their newspapers. In the case of Thompsons, I can say from first-hand experience without interfering with the news agenda of the paper. I only heard once in my 7 years heading the Globe and Mail from a Thompson, from Ken Thompson, about an editorial, and it was about the, it was a 30-year retrospective look at the Canada Soviet 72 hockey series. That's the one that he wanted to talk about. So, so benevolent billionaires are great. There's two problems. We haven't got that many billionaires, and a lot of them aren't benevolent. So in the States, you have the problem in Las Vegas of the paper bought by Sheldon Adelson. He's a billionaire. He's not benevolent. He's using his newspaper to fight his own personal battle. So that's not good. Foundations could be a source of money. We had some beginning of decisions that came out of the revenue minister in Ottawa yesterday, working with a panel on charitable contributions, etc. And I think this will be opened up more as a possible source. There'll be more ability for foundations to put money into things that might be deemed too political in previous occasions, but it's not. You know, there's not a lot of foundation money in Canada either, quite frankly. So I think at the increment it can help, but it's not going to solve it. And then you come to the public. Through the taxpayer, through other devices. Of course, I leave out there the source that we talk about in the Shattered Mirror, which is essentially to put a levy, in a sense, that's very similar to the cable television levy that supports film and TV production in the country and has existed for many years. And the theory there is the distributors don't contribute to content, so they should contribute to content, so they pay a levy that goes to a production fund that supports content. And by and large, that's the recommendation of the Shattered Mirror. The recommendation is to take sellers of digital advertising who do not invest in some minimum threshold of journalism, of editorial in the country. If you invest, you're good, you're fine. If you don't invest, you have to pay the levy in compensation, if you will, for not investing. That would produce a fund, we estimate, of $300 to $400 million a year that would support journalism. Did I speak to that slide too long? Martin O'Hanlon has to sign off.
Much of a delay there. Apologies. There you go.
Okay, I'm just going to go through the last couple points quite quickly because I will go through them quickly. Fake news is a really important subject in on its own, but if you're also looking at investing in the bona fide journalistic enterprises of the country, this is, you know, you don't want to have fake news coming up and genuine news going down at the same time. It's not a very good, combination for democracy. Unfortunately, the incentives and systems of digital media, and I was sort of referring to them a moment ago, are such that, that they're really not, they're kind of like truth and difference. So, you know, this term net neutrality, I always kept using like truth neutrality. You know, they're kind of, it's not that they're against truth, it's just that, you know, they're for clicks, and it doesn't, you know, truth or not truth isn't really an important part of the equation. So because there's such a small unit value in any piece of advertising that goes digital, you need massive scale to be able to break even on a digital ad model. And you scale yourself right out of Canada. You know, you come to the point that you have in, you know, if you want to make films about Canada, there's just not a big enough market to pay for it, or good television production. So you either have to make it also exportable, or you need it to be subsidized, or both. News isn't easily exportable. It's local by nature, and it's perishable by nature. So it's not an easy export piece. We also have the problem of media ecosystems driven by algorithms, and sort of there's a fake news ecosystem that I think I'll just skip over here. And I guess my last point I'll just make is that around fake news and around disinformation, purposeful disinformation campaigns meant to disrupt democracies, is that, you know, in the 1970s, Lake Erie, this is Lake Erie, and Lake Erie was badly polluted, and people said the lake was dying. Now, the fix wasn't like to kind of like close the lake or kill the lake. The fix was to fix the pollution that was going into the lake. And that's the way you know, the internet is a good thing, and there's, it's a great democratizing force in its own right if it is used properly, and if the kind of gangster elements of it are managed appropriately. It does have one inherent flaw in it, which is that there's 5 Great Lakes, and there's 2 great platform companies. And it's not quite enough competition in the platform companies. So that's also at the moment a structural flaw. And I think with that, oops, oh, I apparently have a last slide. So I was really taken by this quote from Thomas Jefferson when I ran across doing the report. So most people who've been in newspaper journalism, at least, are very familiar with Thomas Jefferson's famous quote that I would rather have newspapers without government than government without newspapers. And it's been quoted ad infinitum over many decades and centuries now. But what he says just before he says that actually is the more interesting thing. And what he's basically doing, he's basically kind of predicting Donald Trump back when. He says that, you know, from time to time, voters will make bad choices in elections. But to deny them the right to make bad choices is to deny liberty itself. So the only thing to do is to try to mitigate that possible damage. And you mitigate the damage by giving people full information of their affairs through the channel of, he says, the newspapers, and to contrive that those newspapers should penetrate the whole mass of the people. That's kind of like the CBC in a way, right? You kind of make sure that there's an entity that can give people full information of their affairs and will get to all of the people. It's the complete opposite of echo chambers and filter bubbles. And it's the 21st century. Contrivance, to me, is the 18th century equivalent of public policy in the 21st century. I am done. Thank you.